The first thing, if you're going to be sewing, is you're going to need to assemble your toolkit. So this is something where a lot of people get tripped up, because you start a new hobby, right? And you think, oh, I need to spend like a massive amount of money to get everything set up. And unless I have all the tools, I can't do it properly. So sewing, it really isn't like that. You do need some basic things, like you can't get away with having nothing. But really, there's only a few things you absolutely need to have. And then what I'd recommend is getting those. And then over time, if you get really dedicated to it and you're like, I love this, like this is something I'm going to do a lot of, then you can start looking at the other things that you might consider getting. So what do you need? So you need a sewing machine, basic. So I get asked by people all the time, like, what sewing machine should I get? The reality is 99% of sewing machines are fine, right? Unless you get like a children's sewing machine, which might be a problem. Even like the ones that sometimes now you can get in like Aldi or from IKEA, most of them are totally fine. There are a few things you want, okay? So you need a straight stitch. They literally all have that. It'd be weird if they didn't. You need a zigzag stitch, because you need that if you're gonna make anything stretchy, and you almost certainly will make stretchy things at some point. You want a buttonhole, so that it'll make a buttonhole. And there are some that are fully automatic. They go all the way around. And there are some that are 4 steps. So you have to go 1, 2, 3, 4. All the way around ones are nicer, but like, you don't have to. And it's very helpful if you can get one where the needle can go left and right. Now, the very basic models don't always have that. And you don't need it, but it's really helpful, especially when you're trying to do things accurately. So those are the only things that you have to have. Now, there are other things that are nice, right? So I have a fancy machine in the studio. My one here is not fancy, but in the studio, it automatically cuts threads. It has a knee lever that pulls up and down the presser foot. That's amazing. You don't need that. If you're sewing a lot, or you want to invest like thousands in a machine, which it's literally thousands, that machine, then you can, but you really don't need it. The only thing you may come across if you have a really cheaper sewing machine is the force of the needle to get through the fabric. So let's say you decide you're going to make jeans and you're trying to put the belt loops on a very cheap machine. And by that, I'm talking about like, say, under $100 or under £100, it might struggle. But if you get a starter one and maybe at around like $200 to $300, you should be absolutely fine. And in fact, many of us, I think Carrie sewed on her like $250 machine for like years and years and years and years and years before she upgraded. That's right.
I'm still on the same one.
There we go. So yeah, so a sewing machine. There is another type of sewing machine called a serger or an overlocker that you may have heard of. And it's the one that has 4 big spools of thread at the top. Those are great for sewing knit garments. So like a Concord t-shirt like this one. And they're great for finishing edges, but you don't need one. And all Cashmerette patterns have the instructions written for a regular sewing machine. So there's no pattern where you need another sewing machine. You can always do it on a sewing machine. It might look more professional on a serger, but you can always do it on a sewing machine. So next, oops, sorry, didn't mean to go there. So what else do you need? You need scissors. So you need a pair for cutting fabric and thread, and you need a pair for cutting paper. So it's a good idea to keep them separate, because paper blunts scissors and you want really sharp scissors for your fabric. You can use a rotary cutter that looks like a pizza slicer. What is that? Well, my fire alarms are deciding to test themselves right now. So we'll see what occurs now, because normally I'm not in the house at this time of the day. All right, hopefully that stops. So you can use a rotary cutter, which is like a pizza slicer, and you have it on this like kind of plastic mat. It's great, it goes much faster, but you don't need it. So that's the kind of thing, if you're brand new, I'd wait. I love them, never use scissors to cut things out, but you can wait, you don't need to get that. You need thread, get a decent all-purpose thread. Gutermann is a really, really good brand, so that's one we use. You need either pins or clips. So make sure you get like thin pins, not really chunky ones, because they're hard to use. And there are these little clover clips. They look like a little bit like binders. You can use them instead of pins if you want. You're going to need a hand sewing needle, because occasionally you're going to need to sew things in by hand. You do need an iron. That's really important, and an ironing board. Ideally an iron that doesn't have an auto off. So usually you'd think that's great for safety, right? But for us, it's really, really annoying, because if you're sewing for hours and it keeps on turning off every 5 minutes and you have to move it, it's actually frustrating. So ideally one that has the opportunity, that has not an auto off, or you can override that. And you're almost certainly going to need tracing paper and a pencil. We're going to get onto this in a minute, more about how patterns work, but you're likely going to need it. If you have these things, you can make like anything. There are lots and lots of other tools that over time you might want to get, right? Like a clapper, which makes your seams really flat, like a bodkin that helps you get elastic through things. But these are basically the core basic things that you need.
Jenny, Lisa just commented that she would add one more tool, a seam ripper, which is a good one to have.
Good one. I should have put that on. Yes, a seam ripper. So some people think of a seam ripper as a thing when you've done something wrong, but I tell you, like, you use it all the time. And it's one of the lovely things about sewing is that you could undo a lot of stuff. Not cutting. You can't undo cutting. But if you sew a seam and it doesn't look great, yeah, seam ripper can take it straight out. So definitely very good one. Missed it out on my PowerPoint when my daughter was simultaneously throwing yogurt at me and I was trying to write this. So good point. Okay, were there any more questions on assembling your toolkit, Carrie?
Recommendation for tracing paper.
So some people use medical supply paper, the stuff that goes on the bed in the doctors when you go there. The only problem is, if you're plus size, your pattern pieces may be wider than that, and you'd have to tape them together. So although it's often recommended, I'm like, you can get, it's called Swedish tracing paper, and that's a really nice, like slightly thicker paper. Sometimes it has a grid on it or dots, which is nice for adjustments. We use that a lot, but it's a little bit more expensive. But basically anything, actually, like as long as it's big and can fit over your pattern pieces, any tracing paper is fine. And there are ways to avoid using it, but at least as a beginner, I would recommend it.
And then the only other one was that you'll need some measurement tools as well, like a measuring tape.
Yes, you will need to be able to measure yourself. So tape measure is going to be important. Now, I'm not getting in here into like lots of pattern alterations. If you're doing that, then you definitely need like a ruler, a straight ruler, and it helps to have a curved ruler too. But yes, tape measure, also a good one. This is why I shouldn't write PowerPoints in 5 minutes. All right, let's go on to the next thing. The next thing is taking your measurements. So you may or may not have been on the other webinar where I spent an entire hour talking about taking your measurements and picking your size. So I'm not going to be able to spend an entire hour on that again. So I'm going to give you like the shorter version. But really the key thing here is you have to know your measurements. It's like knowing how much flour is going in a cake, right? If you don't get it right, the garment won't fit you. And what is the point of that, right? Like we're learning to sew precisely so that we can have things that fit us. And it can be kind of emotional, right? For some people, like you see the numbers and you're like, ugh. So one suggestion I always make is you can always use the other units. So if you use inches, you could measure yourself in centimeters and vice versa, and it takes the sting out a bit. But it's also good as a way of just, you know, like recalibrating how you think about yourself. So I'm just gonna get my measuring tape. Okay, so these are the measurements you're gonna need. So the first one you're gonna need is your full bust, which in most brands, they just call it bust, right? So if you just see bust, just one thing, then that is what I'm about to show you. So in order to take your bust, hold on, I'm gonna stand back a little bit here. You take your measuring tape, and you take it around your body, and it needs to be parallel to the floor. So you would normally do this in front of a mirror. I'm doing it in front of the screen and looking at it. And you want it to go over the furthest bit out of your boob where you would like hit the wall. So a lot of books will tell you it's your nipple. Let's face it, we don't all have perky nips. So really what it just means is here, whether my nipple's here or here, doesn't matter, here. So you hold it horizontally. Oh, it kind of helps if you're wearing a stripy top. As you can see, 50 inches right now. So that's your full bust. This is, I'm not going to be able to get into this in detail, but if you're going to end up doing a full bust adjustment, you're going to need to know your high bust. And your high bust is this. It's across your back, under your armpits, and over your boobs, keeping your arms down. 44 and a half. So now you need to know your waist and your hip. So you need to know your waist and your hip standing up and sitting down. The reason is when we sit down, we spread. And if you're making something that doesn't have a lot of room in it or doesn't stretch, we need to make sure that when you're sitting down, you can still go in it, right? So your waist, again, I'm going to move this down so you can see a bit. So this is a hard one, right? Because I don't have a very defined waist. It's like, where is it? Not very clear. In fact, like, frankly, my tights are making me look like I have more of a waist than I do. So let me pull this out. Okay. So like, where is my waist there, right? Like that looks like it is, but not really. So we have a pretty high waist in our patterns. And basically, more or less, it's the narrowest bit of your torso, right? Often they're like, it's where you bend to the side. I mean, look, I didn't bend like this, right? I sort of just, there's rolls. So broadly speaking, it's the smallest bit of your body here, okay? So I would say that was my waist. My belly button, by the way, is here. So it's not at your belly button for anybody, right? It's always above there. So there we go. So what is it? Like 40 and a half standing up. Now what I'm going to do is hold it carefully and sit down. So I'm going to hold it. Ooh, you can't see me, okay? That is now 44 inches, okay? So I've gone up 3.5 inches. Now, you might think like, well, that would be then too big for you, but I need to make sure when I'm sitting down that it still fits me. So you need to know both the numbers. Same thing for your hips. You're going to go around the biggest bit of your hips and your bum. Depending on how you are distributed, you might have, this might be more of a hips measurement, it might be more of a bum measurement. I have no bum. So we go up, what is it? 46 and a half. Now I'm going to sit down. It's a bit hard to do this bit. 52. So it's normal to spread even more there, right? Because there's fat here, it's going to spread when you sit down. So what that means is if I'm making something stretchy, it doesn't really matter, right? Like, because when I sit down, it's going to stretch. But say I was making like a pencil skirt or I was making woven trousers, then I would need to know the sitting down number to make sure that it still fits me when I sit down. You can also measure your bicep, and that's the biggest bit of your arm that's near your armpit. So this is a bit harder one to do yourself, right? So this is one where you might need someone to help you. So I'm going to measure my bicep. Okay, so it's about 14. So I actually have like very disproportionately small arms and legs. So if you have my torso measurements, that's an unusual arm to have. But again, it's helpful because when we start looking at the charts, you're going to be able to compare. So you have to take your measurements. You cannot pick your size based on your clothing size. Okay, it doesn't work. One, because clothing sizes and sewing pattern sizes are totally different. Okay, so you might be a size 12 in clothes in the shops and a size 18 in sewing patterns. You have to just get rid of any feelings you have about the numbers, right? Like, it doesn't matter. You just want it to fit you. It's weird that it's so much bigger. Who cares, right? Just let that one go. But what it means is you must always use your measurements to pick. If you just use your clothes size, you will end up in the wrong size. So that's very important. So you want to take them regularly because also most of us change our sizes all the time, right? So it's an important thing to do. So once you've taken your sizes, you're then going to look at the tables on the pattern to help you understand which size you're going to make. So there are 2 tables on each pattern. And I'll say now that if you find a pattern that doesn't have both tables, it's a sign of a bad pattern, right? It's a sign of a low quality pattern. So you need to watch out for that. So there are 2, the body measurements table and the finished garment. So the body measurements table is what is your body size. So it's those numbers I just took, right? Like 50, I don't remember now, 50, 42, 46, or whatever it was. So you would look at your bust and waist and hip on this chart and you see where you are. The finished garment measurements chart is how big the piece of clothing is. So if you think about it, some clothing is bigger than your body because you can move around in it. right? So think of like a caftan at the most extreme, right? Like it might have like a whole foot of extra space in it. And some garments are smaller than your body. So see the t-shirt I'm wearing right now? It actually is smaller than my body, and it's stretching a little bit over my boobs to get this nice fit. I keep on moving my bra strap, which I need to stop doing because it's annoying even me, probably annoying you guys too. So what you do is you look at where you are on the body measurement chart, and you can compare with the finished garment measurement chart to see, am I going to like this piece of clothing on me? Now, one thing you're probably thinking is, oh no, Jenny, I don't fit in one size. What am I going to do? I'm not like a 20 bust, 20 waist, 20 hip. Well, 90% of people aren't. I just made that statistic up, but it feels right. Most people aren't, right? I should do a survey and see. But I can tell you right now, most people, like a significant majority of people, are not in one size. So this is one of the biggest joys of sewing, and one of the first things you should learn to do when you learn to sew clothes is grade between sizes. So what it means is you can join up like a 22 bust and a 26 waist and a 18 hip. And that is why your clothes are going to fit you much better than in the shops. Okay, it makes a very significant difference. So learning to grade between sizes is a separate thing I can't go into in detail right now, but we have a whole part of our website dedicated to it, and Carrie will share the link. But basically it's join the dots. So you mark what size you are on the bust, and then you mark where you are on the waist, and then you mark where you are on the hips, and you literally join the dots. It is not a difficult thing to do, and it has a profound impact on your clothes fitting you. Because if you think about it, if you can only go to the shops and you can only buy like a straight size 18, but your waist is a 20, you never fit in anything, right? Unless it's baggy. And this is the joy of sewing, is that you can. So that is the basics of measurements and picking your size. So I don't have time today to go into like specifically like, I'm this size, what size should I make? But does anyone have any sort of like slightly more general questions about measuring yourself and picking a size?
We had one question about if the measuring session is available to watch, and it should be on Facebook still, right? Or was that the first one? Oop.
I don't know.
Somebody's screen sharing.
Yeah, hold on. Who can share only hosts? It's already shared as only hosts.
I know.
Weird.
Okay. I'll check into that and see.
Sure, because with the very first one I did, we didn't record or stream, but did we do it? I think maybe we did. Yeah.
I'll check on the Facebook and find it. And then a quick shout out to the Apparel 2 students from Rocky River High School who are here. Yeah. I had to shout them out, especially because my dad's from Rocky River. That's where he grew up.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah.
Maybe your dad is
sorry?
Are there any other questions?
There's one person with a raised hand. Can you type your question into the box as well? And then we'll get that for you. And then let's see, will Jenny explain the difference between the two bicep measurements?
So I think what you're referring to there is on some of our patterns, we have a full bicep piece. So what that means is that we have, what do we call it again? Standard, regular?
Standard.
We have a standard bicep piece and a full bicep piece. And basically the reason we did that is because having to make the arms, the sleeves bigger on something is one of the most common changes that people have to make on our patterns, because we already have the different cup sizes, but a lot of people want to have a bigger sleeve. So what we did is we made a bigger sleeve for you. So what you would do is you just measure your own arm, and then you look at the numbers and you're like, which one would I fit in? Now it's possible you still wouldn't fit in either of them, in which case you have to do a further adjustment. But basically we're trying to make it a bit easier for you by providing you with like already altered patterns.
And then we have another one. Is it a thing to have a bigger back bodice versus front bodice, AKA grade from front to back?
It's an interesting one. A lot of beginners often want to do that, and they often do it in our classes, but it is rarely the right thing to do. And the reason is, it's very unlikely that your entire back is bigger in every way. So think about it, for instance, on your shoulders. Your front shoulder cannot, by definition, be bigger than your back shoulder because they're just one shoulder, right? But you might have like a broader back than the front accounts for. But in that case, what you need to do is a broad back adjustment. Because if you think about it, if everything was bigger, it would assume your back was longer and that your shoulders were wider and that they're wider at the back than the front. And that doesn't really work. So it's rare. It's not absolutely impossible. We did have one person in Australia, Jillian, where we ended up doing a bigger back and a smaller front. But that was the only time I've ever done it, and I've ever really found it works. So it's not impossible, but it's typically not the first place you're going to go, and it's typically not something you're going to do. If you need more room in the back, you want to do a broad back adjustment or a broad shoulder adjustment, not just go up a size.
Okay, and then do you use the sitting or standing measurements when you're choosing your size?
So if you are making something that doesn't stretch, you're using your sitting measurements, okay? Now, if you're making something that does stretch because it's made out of stretchy fabric or it has elastic, or if you're making something really loose, then you can use your standing measurements, okay? So that's the big difference. Use your sitting ones if it doesn't stretch, and use your standing ones if it does stretch or if it's really loose.
And one more quick one, the fabric requirement indicated for a size, is that only for a solid fabric or is it also valid for a printed fabric?
So the fabric requirements, the methodology changes by brand. So for Cashmerette, what we assume is that you might be using a pattern and the pattern goes in one direction. So imagine that you're making something with ducks. You don't want some ducks facing up and some ducks facing down. So instead of cramming them into the most tiny space possible, we make sure that all the pieces are going in a direction. What that means is if you're making it from a solid, it's possible you can use less fabric than we say. But we reckon that it was better to accommodate like the most someone might need, and you might have a bit too much, than the opposite, which is tell everyone only for a solid, and then they make a print and they're like, oh no, I need like another yard of fabric. So that's how we have done it. Not all companies, though, do exactly the same thing. So you would actually have to ask a pattern company about that.
And one last one, how do you pick hip sizes when you have narrow hips and the high hip is larger than the low hip?
So you want to use the largest number, basically. One thing you can do is you can measure where the hips are on the pattern compared to the waist and compare it to yourself, right? So there's usually a notch on Cashmerette. There's a notch for the waist, or there's a waistband, and there's a notch for the hip. So you can measure down on a specific pattern because it's different on different patterns, right? And you could be like, okay, you know, this is like 9 inches down. And then you can measure across the pattern and say, okay, this pattern at 9 inches down is 48 inches around. And then you can compare it to yourself. And you can see, well, where is my high hip? And what's my high hip number? So this is a little bit more sophisticated, but what I would say is we always recommend making a trial garment first. And it's often called a muslin, which is confusing because muslin is also a fabric, but we always recommend making a trial garment first, especially when you're a beginner. But even if you're very advanced, we usually do it. And you do that to basically save your precious fabric. You don't want to make something straight on the precious fabric, right? You want to make it in a basic fabric and you can check the fit first. So either you can do lots of measurements or you can make your best estimate from your bust, waist, and hip, make a muslin and check. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next part. So the next part is picking your first pattern. So I've got a couple of guidelines and then a couple of specific suggestions. So the first one is that woven fabrics are easier to sew, but knits are okay. And I'm going to get on in a minute to what do I mean by woven and knit. But basically, not stretchy things like cotton are easiest to sew. Secondly, you want to look for something that doesn't have any closures. And by that, I mean buttons or zips. Now, it's very easy for a very long time to be like, I can't sew buttons or zips. Like, I think I didn't sew one for like a year or something. They're not actually that hard. But for a first pattern, you want to make something and feel good about it, right? You want to have a positive experience of sewing. So pick something that just goes on over your head. A minimal number of seams is a good idea. And what I mean by that is you don't want something with like loads and loads of panels that you have to like sew together, because it's more likely you're going to have issues. And also something that comes in your size. Now, this is a luxury, obviously. So there's, for some people, you aren't going to be able to find a pattern in your size, and that is incredibly frustrating. One thing you can do is go to Cashmerette. Carrie will provide the link. We actually have a list of all the brands and what sizes they go up to, ones that go into plus sizes, so you can see. Commonly, about a size 32 tends to be the max. However, there are now a few brands. There's one called Muna and Broad, which is going up higher. And there are occasional ones. But assuming that you're smaller than about a size 32, 34, make a pattern that comes in your size initially. It's hard to make patterns bigger, and often things can go wrong. So I would always recommend that. In the future, if you want to make a pattern from a company that doesn't come in your size and make adjustments, you can, but I wouldn't start there. So for Cashmerette, here are a couple of the ones that I would recommend to start with. So we have the cedar top. So this is the one on the left here that I'm modeling. So this is super easy, okay? The sleeves are all part of the top. So you don't put in an extra sleeve, because doing a sleeve is like, it's not difficult, but it's like one next step up. There are only 2 pattern pieces plus some facings, and you're going to learn how to basically finish a neckline and finish a hem in a nice way. And it works for wovens or knits. And it's very easy to fit because it's slightly loose. So the cedar top is like really, maybe if I had to pick like a single thing, I would say make the cedar top. Very good for beginners. Then there's the Springfield top. So that's more of a tank. So it's sleeveless. It has a very similar construction to the cedar top, but you'll learn how to put bust darts in here. And that's actually really crucial most of the time. If you have big boobs, you're going to need to know how to do darts. And it has 2 versions with different backs. If you're more into like dresses than tops, the Turner dress is a great place to start. Now this is for knit fabrics, but it is about as basic a pattern really as you can kind of get for knits. And it's really fun, you know, like it looks great on many people. This is our gorgeous model, Michelle, in a 32. So if you want to make a dress, that would be our recommendation for your first dress. And then one more is the Montrose top. So you can see here, it's in like a very fancy fabric, all embroidered, but it doesn't have to be. It's not specifically, you know, only for embroidered fabrics. What's nice about this is it's like a t-shirt, but it's not stretchy. So you can have something with sleeves. If you're really into wearing sleeves, that's an option. So you'll learn to put sleeves in. But beyond that, it's basic, right? Like it's simple pieces that go together. So that would be another good one. And what I really recommend is find a pattern that looks really simple and that you think you would like. And what's amazing when you learn to sew is all of a sudden you make one, right? And then the power goes to your head. You're like, ha, 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 I shall make 100 of these. That is the most common thing. And that's a great way to go about it, because you get enthusiastic, you find different fabrics and you're like, oh my goodness, like I made a Montrose. Now I'm going to make a stripy Montrose. Now I'm going to make a linen Montrose. Now I'm going to make a Doctor Who Montrose. It's a great way to like get more confident in sewing. We also have really comprehensive instructions. So they're really made with like beginners in mind. So you will be able to do it. Okay, so that's patterns. Did anyone have questions on patterns, Carrie?
Sorry, I forgot I was muted. One question from Kathy. Can you do longer 3/4 sleeves on the cedar?
Not really, no. It's not made for that. Some people have, so it's a dolman sleeve, which is kind of a different structure. Some people have literally made tubes and like sewn them on. It works technically, like, will it cover your arm? Yes. Will it fall nicely? Not really, no. So if you want longer sleeves, you're really gonna want the Montrose top.
And then, Amy, do you want to ask this question live? I'm not quite sure what you're wondering about with your size. If you raise your hand. Okay, here. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Amy.
Okay.
If I can find you. Here you are. Okay, you're unmuted, Amy.
Okay, so I'm hoping I can find something that will be my size. in one of these patterns, but also, like, if you can't, I mean, technically, can you use algebra or like math to figure out like what you'll need to cut, like, like the when doing your measure? Do you know what I'm saying? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Okay.
So you can. So it's called grading up.
Oh, okay.
And the best place to find information on that right now is the Curvy Sewing Collective. So you
I'll
go to
pop the link in.
curvysewingcollective.com, and there are a series of blog posts with different approaches to how you do it. So the most basic thing is when you look at a sewing pattern, it has lines up the side. And so you can see how much they're adding for each line, right? So maybe each line is going up 1/4 of an inch.
Right.
So theoretically, you can just add another 1/4 of an inch. Now, that's like a basic way to do it. And it ultimately, like, it would work for a size or two. If you need to go like 10 sizes up, that doesn't work because it distorts everything. And that's why actually like patterns with good grading is like a really important like factor, especially for plus size patterns, because some are much better than others. There are other ways to do it where effectively like you dice it up into squares and then you spread all the squares. Like that's another way to do it. So yes, so there are ways to do it. The other thing to bear in mind is, remember I said there were two tables. There's the body table and the finished garment. So always look at the finished garment, because sometimes you might actually fit in a size even if the body measurement says you wouldn't. So I'll give you an example. Our largest hip size is 62 inches, right? Our 32 is 62 inches. But if you make the Turner dress, I don't have this in front of me right now, but the measurement is something like 100 inches because it's a really floaty dress. So what that means is even if your hips were like 75 inches, you would actually be totally fine in that dress if your upper half fit. So that's the other thing to look at. It's not like, ideal. Ideally, all patterns would be available in all sizes. But sometimes you can sort of get in a size that initially looks like you couldn't if you look at the finished garment sizes. It's harder in the upper body. Like that's something that works well for like if your waist or your hip is bigger. If your bust is bigger, that starts to get a little bit more tricky. But yeah, that's how you would go about it. Also, you, Amy, or anyone can always email us at hello@cashmerette.com, and we help people one-on-one with their sizing every day, all day. So if you have questions about what might you fit in or how could you grade up, we're always happy to answer them directly. Hope that helped. All right, Carrie, were there any more questions?
I'm muted. I keep talking while I'm muted. Yes, so when you make adjustments to a muslin, one of the questions was, do you then take apart that muslin to transfer the changes to your pattern? Or what's the best way to do that?
Typically, yes. Typically, yeah. So what you would do is you want to make your muslin out of something like not precious, right? And we usually just use a Sharpie. So like sometimes you don't have to take it apart. So for instance, sometimes we'll say you do a shoulder and the shoulder's too wide for you. So these shoulders are actually good. But let's just say the shoulder was off my shoulder here. And we were like, oh no, we need to bring it here. We would mark that with a Sharpie and then we would simply measure that. And that would be enough. You wouldn't have to deconstruct the muslin to figure it out. Other times, like you might say you want to change the shape of a side seam, because like say it's going over your hips, but it's like too high up or something. You would mark your hip with a Sharpie again. There's just like non-stop beeping going on in my apartment. Now, 1 second. Look at me testing the fire alarms in my apartment now.
Oh, good.
Excellent. This is real life for you. Okay, we now know not to do them on Thursday, April 23rd, apparently. Okay, so in that case, if you were changing the shape of your side seam, then yes, what you would do again is you would mark it in a Sharpie, and then you would take the muslin apart with a seam ripper, and you would be able to transfer that shape back onto your muslin. Okay.
So Cheryl said she meant to take it apart and use it as the pattern, but I think this would basically effectively do the same thing.
I mean, technically you could. I think the issue with that would be like fraying and things like that. Like that's not typically how people do it. Maybe couture, I don't know. But one of the nice things about sewing is like actually there pretty much are no rules. right? Like sometimes it's presented as this very like formal, like this is how you do it. No, it isn't. If you sew something together and it fits your body and it doesn't fall off, woohoo, you sewed a garment, right? Like who cares? Like you can do whatever you want. If it fits you, if it works, go for it. Like I am very relaxed about this type of thing. But I think that's the reality. Like you make it and then it works. Like there's no person coming along to like assess you and give you a grade. So.
And then we've got another one. I got the Alcott dress. Is that a good beginner pattern? And are the collared pants a good first pant? Well, the collared pants are definitely a good first pant.
Yes, collared pants are great. Would they be a very good very first project? The elastic is slightly difficult if you've never sewn before, but they're a great first pants pattern. Like definitely, if you want to make pants for the first time, pants do the collared. The Alcott, I would say no, not for a first pattern, because you have to put a lot of layers together at the waist and put this elastic in. And I think if you'd never done it before, it'd be a bit challenging. Now, nothing is impossible. I have friends where the very first thing they ever made was a button-down shirt, right? Which generally would not be my recommendation for a beginner pattern. You might be able to, like if you feel confident, why not? Give it a shot. It won't be the easiest thing though, right? Like maybe you might, if you've never done it before, want to start with something else a bit more simple. All right, I'm going to move on to the next point. So let me get this back up again. Hopefully that's the end of fire alarm stuff.
Famous last words.
Okay. Do you know what? I'm going to mute myself and let you, Carrie, talk about pattern formats for a minute.
Okay. So pattern formats. So the patterns are available from us and also from most brands in a variety of formats. Obviously right now we're not able to ship because our studios shut down. So right now printed patterns aren't really available from us, but printed patterns come and they are on tissue typically. Some patterns print on actual paper. Ours are on a thicker tissue, just like you would have seen at like a shop like Joann's or whatever, traditional sewing pattern tissue. And ours are all multi-sized. So a lot of times we'll get questions like, which size pattern should I buy? You don't have to buy a specific size with us. And with most indie patterns, you don't. Style Like, I think, is the big exception to that. So printed patterns, you get a physical product, and some people really love that. So you have the pattern, you have the instructions in front of you. You don't have to print anything out. You don't have to tape the pieces together, which is Jenny's least favorite thing to do on the planet. And then you have it, but you do have to trace it off, because if you just cut your tissue from your printed pattern, you're never going to be able to make a different size. So we always recommend tracing your size, especially if you're making any changes, or you might want to make a different size later for yourself or for somebody else. So you definitely want to trace your printed tissue. Now PDF is a little bit more flexible. You get the downloads and they come with print at home files. And then a lot of times there's also copy shop files. Ours all have that. And there's some, you can get them printed at like Staples or whatever, but there's some great resources online. Jenny, we're still looking at your screen. You can go back. There's some great resources online, and I'll pop a link in there. We have a how to print PDF whole piece on our blog, and we're also going to have a whole bunch of extra details coming up in some blog posts. Sorry, Jenny keeps changing the slides on me. But when you print PDFs at home, they can print on either A4 or letter paper, and you just need to make sure that they're printing correctly. The amount of times that people make a pattern from a poorly printed at-home PDF, it's really unfortunate, because then it's just not going to fit. I did it recently, and I've been sewing for a long time, so it definitely can happen. So on ours, there's a grid behind every page that is 1 inch by 1 inch squares. If those are not 1 inch by 1 inch, you have to reprint. I know it's a bummer, but you're going to be really sad if you make a whole garment and it's 10% too big all over because your squares were 1.1 inches by 1.1 inches. So that's a really important thing. In our PDF instructions, there's a whole page on what your printer settings need to be, how to use the PDF to print it. But again, please feel free to email us, hello@Cashmerette, if you have any questions about that, because that's going to be absolutely essential to get a good result. Oh, Jenny's popping some links in here for printing. PDFplotting.com is one that we use a lot in the States, and then in the UK there's netprinter.co and Foldline. Foldline's in Australia, I think, right?
No, that's UK as well.
Oh, there. Okay. Jenny, are you ready to go back in?
We'll take it over. Although that was one thing, we have to evacuate your building if the tone goes off. So maybe you'll see like big flames appearing any minute and me like running out with a naked baby. It's possible.
Hopefully
all right.
Not.
I am going to go on to the next point, which is selecting your fabric. So selecting your fabric is really, really important to getting a good result. And it's something that can be quite stressful when you're a new sewer. I remember being like, how am I meant to know what works? Where on earth do I buy this stuff? Because if you only have nearby you like a quilting shop, that kind of quilting cotton doesn't tend to work very well. You can use it for woven tops, but honestly, it often doesn't look great. So the first thing you need to know is there's a difference between woven fabric and knit fabric. So basically, woven fabric is literally woven, right? So I'm going to get it the wrong way. There's warp and weft. I don't remember which way they are. So there's threads going like this and threads going like this, and they go across each other, right? And mostly it doesn't stretch. There are stretch wovens, like your jeans are a stretch woven. And what that means is that some of the threads that they are actually like elastic. They have like spandex in them, which allows a bit of stretch, but not very stretchy, just a little bit of stretch wovens. So wovens are things like cotton, linen, silk, all stay stable. And as I already mentioned, they're actually sort of the easier ones to, well, most of them are easier to sew with. I'm going to get onto like ones that aren't in a minute. So there are lots of types of cotton, like cotton lawn, cotton voile, lots and lots and lots of different versions. But cotton is a good place to start. Knit fabric is literally knitted. So if you zoomed in with a microscope, you would see it like this in loops, and the loops are connecting to each other. And what that means is it's very stretchy. So what I'm wearing is a knit fabric, very stretchy. So most of us wear knits most of the time, right? Like most ready-to-wear clothing is made out of knits. So it's a really good thing to learn how to sew with, but it is slightly tricky to begin with. You have to use a zigzag stitch on a sewing machine, because if you use a straight stitch on a knit and it stretches, all the stitches pop out and it breaks. But you don't need a serger. It's nice to have one. You don't need one. You can just use a zigzag. What you want to avoid when you're brand new, and again, I say all of this as if it's a rule. It's not a rule. You want to go straight for a hard thing? Go straight for a hard thing. Go you. You just might get a little bit frustrated, that's all. So avoid anything that's very thin, very slippery, or frays a lot, okay? Silk, not a great first thing to use, also expensive, but not a great first thing. Very slinky jersey. There are some jerseys you can buy that like are cold to touch them, and they're really slinky. They're also really hard, and they often curl up at the edges terribly when you're trying to sew with them. Like I mentioned, quilting cotton, you can, like I've seen people make amazing like Upton dresses out of quilting cotton. One of our like mega fans, Rachel, who's made like 60 Upton dresses or something, uses quilting cotton often, and they look awesome. But it is something where it's like, if you're trying to make your stuff look more like something you'd buy in a store, you typically don't want to go to that. So the next big question is, where do you go? So obviously, if you're in the US, you can go to like big chain stores like Joann's, and they have a selection. They have some stuff that's terrible. They have some stuff that's great, but you want to go in. But what we do a lot is buy online. Now, buying online seems really scary because you're like, I can't feel it. The good news is most of these shops will send you a sample first, either free or just for shipping, or for like $1, like very, very cheap. And that's a great idea, right? Because you can then touch it, see if it's the right thickness, see if it's the right color. So we really love buying designer fabric. And the reason I wrote designer fabric is when clothes brands are producing things on a big scale, they usually have a bit left over, right? So let's just say like Diane von Furstenberg orders like 10,000 yards for their wrap dresses, but at the end they have like 100 yards left. They sell it on to fabric shops. And there are some fabric shops that specialize in buying this stuff. Sometimes it's called dead stock, sometimes they're called jobbers. So this is what I love, because this stuff is usually very high quality, and often you can get like prints and colors that you can't get that were made for the home sewing market. So my all-time favorite is Emma Onesock. Spent many, many thousands of dollars with her. Always recommend checking her out. Gorgeous Tech Fabrics is also a great one. Metro Textiles is a really cool shop in New York who now actually have a website as well. And they have like weirdly cheap, incredibly expensive things, if you see what I mean. Like they should be expensive, but they're not. So those are all US. Fabric Godmother in the UK often has a lot of designer fabric as well. And sometimes I have her stuff shipped over because she gets like beautiful stuff from Italy. So those are examples of places that you can get like high-end fabric. If you want high quality home sewing fabric that's been made more for the home sewing market, Blackbird Fabrics, which is based in Canada but ships internationally, has beautiful stuff. They're very on trend. They're very inspirational social media if you follow them. Like, so they're really cool. And they're very integrated with the home sewing community. So if you're like, oh, I love that linen, but what would I make with it? Chances are they are showing you like, here are like 8 trouser patterns that you can make with our linen, that kind of stuff. Stitch Sew Shop is an awesome shop in Alexandria, Virginia, who have beautifully curated stuff and they send it all over the place. Hearts Fabric, also great. Fabric Mart. There's also fabric.com. They're owned by Amazon. Make of that what you will. But if you want to buy something really specific, and there are some brands that are known, for instance, there's like Cotton and Steel and Ruby Star Society, which are like well-known brands of fabric. You often can get them somewhere like fabric.com. So you want to begin by, you know, trying to get like inexpensive fabric. But one thing I wanted to mention, remember I mentioned making a trial garment? So when you make a trial garment, it needs to be made out of a similar fabric that it's designed for. So what I mean by that is, I'll be extreme. You can't make an example of a pair of jeans out of t-shirt material, right? It just doesn't behave the same. If you're making an example of a pair of jeans, it needs to be in denim. And if the jeans are for stretch denim, the denim needs to be stretched. Going off again. On the flip side, if you're making a woven top, it needs to be in a woven fabric. So you need to make sure that the basic idea is the same. Now, it doesn't need to be identical. So for instance, let's say you wanted to make a silk dress. You don't need to make the trial garment out of silk. You could make it out of a slinky polyester, which feels really similar, right? Like it also doesn't stretch, it flows in the same way, but you want something similar. For cheap fabric, there's different options. You can use like old bed sheets. You can go to thrift stores and find sheets there, or find things that you can cut down. You can also just, you know, buy things when they're on sale. So you'll often find things like fabric.com will sometimes have sales. You might be able to get like a very basic cotton for like $3 or $4 a yard. It really depends on where you live. I know in Australia, like, holy moly, like so expensive your fabric over there. I'm sorry, guys. But if you're in the US, it's a lot easier to get cheaper fabric, or in the UK to a certain degree. So yeah, so that is fabrics. Were there any questions on that, Carrie?
Yeah, so one quick question for links. I'm going to gather all the links from this session and I'll put them in the YouTube description when we post it, so you can find
links. And I
links
can email them as well to everyone.
Okay, great.
If you gather them together, I'll email them out to everybody. And I can email
perfect.
the slides as well, actually, thinking about it. Why not?
Yeah.
I'll email you guys the PDF of the slides.
And then there's a couple specific fabric questions about different substrates, but we're actually going to do a whole webinar about fabrics coming up. So we'll save those because they're a little bit more detailed. And then one last one, thoughts on spoon flour for sourcing fabrics?
Yeah, so Spoonflower, if you don't know, print fabric to order. So they have a bunch of substrates, so like different types of fabric, and they custom print on it. And you can either put your own design, or you can pick from a massive library. So here is the basic on this. Their synthetics are very good. Okay, so if you use their synthetic fabrics. So for instance, they have one called Modern Jersey, which is like a polyester blend jersey. It's great. It doesn't feel like polyester, at least to me, it doesn't. You might not wear it in like Arizona in the summer, but like you could wear it, I could wear it today for sure. They wash really well, keep their colors vibrant, very nice. The cotton ones, the colors don't always come out great. They wash out a bit. And you definitely need to watch out if you're printing anything really dark. So like, say you were printing black, I probably just wouldn't even. Maybe on Modern Jersey it would be okay, but I wouldn't try and print like a black based thing on the cotton, because they're printed on a white background. So what would happen is when you stretch, you will see all the white coming through, and also it washes out on the cotton quite easily. It's also pretty expensive. So you want to probably try something first and try. But basically, bottom line is spoon flour, synthetics are great. Be a bit wary of the rest of it.
And the one last one I forgot, the fabric requirements, there was a question if that was for pre-wash fabrics or if they can buy that amount and have enough. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so we pad a little bit. So we pad about 10% onto our fabric requirements. And we do that for all kinds of reasons. Like often our cutting layouts are really tight. So unless you are exactly correct, you need a bit more. And also, you know, sometimes you buy from a fabric store and they cut the fabric like this and you suddenly lost a few, you know, like a couple of inches. So we put 10% in. That means probably you can just buy that amount. You will be safe just buying the amount that we recommend, unless it's something that's going to like shrink by like 30%. But if it does that, something's wrong. That does bring up a really good point though. If you're learning to sew, always wash your fabric first. The only exception is fabrics you will never be washing. So for instance, if you make a coat and it will only ever be dry cleaned, you don't need to wash it. And you also don't need to pre-dry clean it. I've heard people say that, but you really don't need to do that. But
unless it's 100% wool, and then you should, because it will shrink in dry cleaning.
Well, there you go. Or just don't ever clean your coats like me. But you do need to pre-wash fabric because it does shrink. And yes, people are mentioning it, and it's very true. Rayon shrinks a lot, flannel shrinks a lot. Anything with wool you need to be very careful about. And with things like denim, you actually potentially want to wash them several times beforehand. Often people will wash them like 2 or 3 times, also with like vinegar to try and set the dye. So that is something that's really mandatory. It's sort of funny actually, like in the studio when we're making samples, often we're like in a hurry. So we're like, let's just make it straight out. And I always have to be like, do I ever want to wear this? Because if I ever want to wear this sample, we need to pre-wash it first. Otherwise I won't be able to, because on numerous occasions, oh my goodness, there was like this 2 beautiful Rivermont dresses we made, and I loved them. They were like some of my favorite dresses ever, and I put them in the wash and they were like, whoop. I was like, no, we should have pre-washed them. So anyway, learn from my mistakes, people. Okay, we only have a few minutes left. So what I wanted to do is share with you some further resources. So here are other places, if you're just learning to sew, that you can learn more. And the good news is there is so much on the internet. I taught myself to sew from the internet, basically. Like I had 1 or 2 classes that honestly were not very helpful. I learned from the internet. So go to the Cashmerette blog, you can search, and we have tons of instructions, tons of tutorials that you can find there. We also have online workshops. Now, right now, we don't have one for beginner sewers. It's something we've been considering, but we do have fitting for curves. So if you want to learn how to adjust your patterns to fit your body, fitting for curves is the one. The Curvy Sewing Collective, which I co-founded, also has an enormous blog, maybe even like more content than Cashmerette, and it has huge numbers of tutorials, also pattern reviews, and there's a whole beginner series there too. So that's great. If you want to go outside the little Jenny Rushmore orbit, and fair enough, everyone needs to. I'd like to sometimes. You can look at Tilly and the Buttons. So she has a lot of beginner stuff. Fair warning, not really very plus size, right? Like she's getting there a little bit more now. There are some patterns that if you have big boobs, I would just stay away from. Like top tip, if a pattern ever has the same pattern piece for the front and back, it's a problem if you have boobs, right? Because you don't have back boobs equally out. I mean, maybe you do. If you have back boobs, more power to you. But what they're assuming is that you're flat on the front and the back. So that's the same. However, she has like class on how to use a sewing machine, right? Like really basic. And she's excellent at it, right? Like that's her specialty, is beginner sewing. So her online workshops are good. And you can use them and apply it to Cashmerette patterns, right? You don't have to make a Tilly pattern just because you're doing a Tilly workshop. She has one on like how to sew stretch fabrics. You could do that and make the Concord t-shirt if that fit you, because Tilly's didn't. And then my friend Heather over at Closet Case Patterns, she has another online workshop on how to learn to sew. And it comes with 3 or 4 patterns, I can't remember now, but they're Rome collection, and it basically shows you how to sew like a top, a skirt, and a pair of pants. So those 2 folks are like really fantastic. Another option is Blueprint, that used to be known as Craftsy, which is basically like a full online platform that has tons and tons and tons of sewing. I looked, and they actually don't have an intro to sewing one, which is a funny like gap. You would think that would be an obvious thing that they have, but they have lots of different topics. And now they have a new system where you basically pay a subscription and you can get access to all of them. So there's tons and tons and tons of ones on there, including one from me about full bust adjustments. So apologies for the fact that we were interrupted about 73 times by various alarms going off that apparently have now stopped and we're not evacuating. So it is slightly nerve-wracking because, was it last week? I can't remember. There was a 6-foot flood on my street and the road literally collapsed and there was a sinkhole. So who knows? Maybe that's happened outside again. I don't know. But thank you for staying with us. We will email you the slides and we'll email you the links. And as I mentioned, you can always email us at hello@cashmerette.com. If you want to support us, obviously, like, it's a rough time for small business right now. We have lost all our wholesale orders. We have lost all our physical orders. We cannot do photo shoots, not the easiest time. So, you know, if you can support us by buying a pattern or buying a workshop, that's amazing. But even if you can't do that, you know, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, tell a friend about us. Everything really helps. Or write a review. We have a review platform on our website, and the more reviews we can get there or on Facebook or on Google, the better. So I hope you enjoyed it. It's always a highlight of my week, and I will see you guys next week.